Hi folks, this is Chelsea. So today I'll be walking through the 3 methods of teaching ethical persuasion. Most of the time in English classes, students will at multiple points, at multiple years, address what is ethos, logos, and pathos and how are they used in persuasion. But I actually want to take that a step further and not only look at logical fallacies, but how persuasion can be used ethically. How can we truly sell our thought, our belief, our product without deliberately misleading our audience. And so I think that's a really important practice to learn in the world today. And so that's what my lessons are based around. So for each of my individual methods, I follow the same essential questions. And those are, what is ethical use of persuasion? How do I identify misleading persuasive claims? And how do I adhere to ethical standards in my own persuasion? And I also have a similar set of objectives for each type of method. And so students will be able to identify examples of ethos, logos, and pathos with about 90% accuracy. They will also be able to define ethical persuasion and articulate its importance, both to themselves and in the world as a whole. They will analyze advertisements or a song, some other text for misleading and unethical persuasion strategies. And they'll be able to find and explain at least one example within 3 advertisements, so one example each. They will also be able to use ethos, logos, and pathos in an advertisement that they create, or in a speech that they create that strongly adheres to ethical persuasion guidelines and contains no more than 2 misleading or unethical uses of persuasion. So the 3 methods that I chose, I have one inquiry-based method focused on guided inquiry. There's also a mastery-based method using the gradual release of responsibility technique. And I also have a wildcard method for you that I really like doing. I've done this in the past, but I've revised it for the purposes of this assignment. And this is a way of teaching so that students learn through aesthetic connections. So let's get started. So the first, inquiry-based method, using guided inquiry, I break it down into those guided inquiry steps. So lesson 1 would be opening and immersing. And for most of these, students will work in groups unless otherwise indicated. So for opening this topic, student groups would find ads on YouTube, and then for 3 of the ads that they find, write brief explanations about how those ads make their case. Now this happens before students learn about ethos, logos, and pathos. Some may have that in their background knowledge, but it won't be activated prior to the lesson. It's just focused on understanding holistically what the students know. Then with immersion, students would independently complete a short web quest to understand the history of persuasion, so like starting with Aristotle and the Greeks and such. They'd understand persuasion techniques, define ethos, logos, pathos, and they'd also find logical fallacies and answer a few web questions on those. Lesson 2 would be focused on exploring, immersing, and identifying. So with the exploration stage, groups would come back together, they'd find examples of ads or use the ones that they had before, and they'd identify how ethos, logos, and pathos are used in those, as well as whether the ads contain any of the logical fallacies they learned about in their web quest. Then groups would present their analysis on one of their ads, to show their peers how to be aware of persuasive techniques so they're not misled. So they're already starting to see the application of this process in the real world in lesson 2. Lesson 3 would be the creation and gathering stage. So this might occur over a couple days, but groups would pick a product or design their own and create an ad that includes all 3 types of persuasion and adheres to ethical persuasion guidelines that we define. And then you'd have groups pairing off to test their ads with each other, kind of using each other as focus groups. So you'd have group A showing their ad to group B. Group B would act like the focus group and explain what group A needs to do to revise so that their ad isn't misleading, and to improve their persuasive impact, and vice versa. And lesson 4 would be the sharing to the whole class and evaluation stages. So groups would present their ad to the whole class, and then their classmates would have time to identify where their techniques were used, so where is ethos, logos, and pathos, and evaluate whether those ads are misleading at all, and whether the group that created them used those ethical persuasion guidelines. And then the class as a whole would discuss whether it's possible to completely avoid misleading the audience, as well as what they learned about persuasion in the world around them. So this is the inquiry-based method. It's a lot more organic than some other methods, and it's definitely very student-centered. But let's take a look at the mastery-based method. And for this, I use the gradual release of responsibility, but it's not just an I do, we do, y'all do, you do individually. I do that same kind of structure across multiple days. So I'll show you what that looks like. So in lesson 1, this is where students are understanding ethos, logos, and pathos. So for the hook, I'll show some Super Bowl ads, and we'll discuss the methods of persuasion, and I'll give the definitions through direct instruction. Then we as a class will identify where in the Super Bowl ads we find ethos, logos, and pathos. So we'll work together on that. Then students will get into groups for the y'all do to find examples of ethos, logos, and pathos in ads that they find on YouTube, so something brand new. And for homework, or maybe starting at the end of class that day, students would have independent practice on identifying verbal examples of ethos, logos, and pathos on worksheets. So just really getting that skill down for them. Lesson 2 is kind of broken up across multiple days. So on the first one, they define ethical persuasion. So I lead a discussion on defining ethical persuasion and show them a case study of unethical persuasion. There are many examples of ads, particularly with the tobacco industry, that would be perfect for this. Then it would be a we do. The class will make a list of ethical persuasion do's and don'ts. So I'd be able to guide them and kind of maybe activate some ideas. And they'd also, have a say in that. And then groups would come back together to go back to the ads that they found in lesson 1 and identify any unethical persuasion and explain to the class why it violates the list of do's and don'ts that we came up with. And then day 2, we'd kind of review the class guidelines on ethical persuasion at the beginning. And that's where the students would then begin to make their own ad. And then they'd independently write a reflection about what ethical persuasion means to them and why it's important. And this has probably got to be my favorite method. This is my wildcard method, and it's all based on a particular song by the Beastie Boys, You Gotta Fight for Your Right to Party. And I've done a similar activity, but this time I really focused on kind of incorporating both guided inquiry and mastery-based methods. So let's take a look. So in lesson 1, we just learned about ethos, logos, and pathos and the logical fallacies, just learning how to identify them. But we'd start with a hook, with a journal hook, where students would identify something that they want to convince their parents about, and what arguments they've used to convince their parents about that in the past and whether or not it's worked. Then we talk about persuasion, and I give direct instruction in ethos, logos, and pathos and those logical fallacies. Most likely I do this with a high school group because they've probably been exposed to ethos, logos, and pathos before. And so we could jump into those logical fallacies a little bit sooner than with, say, a 7th grade group. So after the direct instruction, then we'd have a think, pair, share. So we'd so basically the pair would identify examples of ethos, logos, and pathos and any logical fallacies in their partner's journal. So that's kind of learning how to apply and some of that social learning. We'd then have a Kahoot to identify techniques and fallacies, just with like a little class quiz. And then they'd have that independent practice worksheet similar to the mastery-based model. Now, day 2, lesson 2, is my absolute favorite. So students would listen to the Beastie Boys' You Gotta Fight for Your Right to Party. And that is so full of logical fallacies. So they first have to identify the argument. We do that as a group. Because it's not that you gotta fight, that's not really the argument, that's a given for them. It's more like that you have a right to party, and that can be argued more than whether or not you gotta fight for it. Then students would get into groups and use their cheat sheet to identify examples of ethos, logos, and pathos and any of those logical fallacies. And they get to revise the lyrics to take out the fallacies. Students who can keep the structure of the song and the rhythm of the lyrics will then get bonus points for doing so and compete for a class prize. So I've done something similar in the past. Students really love this, and they think it's very fun, and it kind of gets them riled up. Lesson 3 is going back to that argument based on what students want to convince their parents to let them do. And then students would rewrite their journals to take out any logical fallacies, rewrite their arguments, basically make it nice and solid. And they'd share in groups of 3. So the other 2 students would act like they're the parents and determine whether they would assent to what the kid is saying or override their child's wishes. Now, I'd instruct the students to really think of themselves as being, caretakers, guardians, really think like parents, and, have enforce strict guidelines. And I anticipate that this would be a really fun way to test all that out. And then we'd get together for a class-wide reflection. What did they learn? And would it be possible to convince parents of anything, including that there is a right to party? So these are the 3 methods that I came up with. I think they could all work. It would probably depend on the group that I have, the level of background knowledge that they have, and their level of maturity as well. But I think all 3 could be really useful. So I'm curious to see what you think. Give me a holler in the comments, and I can't wait to see what you guys come up with too. Thanks for listening.